Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out here on this beautiful summer evening. My name is Mark Tudors, and I'd like to welcome you to the first in a multi-part series connected to the Amsterdam Center for European Studies and also supported by the Global Digital Culture Research Priority Area. On the topic for this series is diagonalism and the crisis of liberalism. And the idea of this series is to reflect on the 21st century apparent realignment of the politics of the long 20th century. For example, with the rise of new or newly fashionable far-right subcultures online, the so-called alt-right, and the return of what looks a lot like fascism, but also the sort of weird phenomenon of seemingly emergent post-COVID new categories like conspirituality, which speaks to the intersection of wellness culture and conspiracy theory. So I've worked on this series together with Gavin Muller, who's sitting there. And we come from new media studies, and central to our approach is an emphasis on the disruptive affordances of technologies, of new technologies. We can kind of consider this in connection to the new kinds of categories like influencers and their relationships to their audiences, the relationships that influencers have to the platform, the relationship that audiences have to algorithms, and also the idea of memes that kind of traverse the digital. What we're interested in is how all of these different digital actors are kind of entwined in these multi-directional feedback loops that exert a degree of influence on each other, and what kind of effect that has on the political. So in order to try to make sense of this very tricky multi-directional problem that I just outlined, we're inviting a few of who we consider to be the best minds on this topic. And so that's what brings me to our guest tonight, Alan, who is Alan Finlayson, who's a professor of political and social theory at the University of East Anglia in the UK. He's a leading advocate of rhetorical political analysis for the study of British politics, but also more recently of what he has been calling, and what quite a number of us also after Alan have been calling, radical digital politics. Reactionary digital politics. Indeed. And we'll talk about that actually after Alan's talk. So I got to know Alan through his work that I had the opportunity to participate in a podcast and a conference that he produced on this topic of reactionary digital politics during the COVID lockdown interregnum. And since then, I and many of my colleagues have closely followed Alan's publications in this area in journals like Theory, Culture and Society, Political Studies, and other venues. And in these texts, Alan moves between theorizing the effects of platforms like YouTube on politics, but also historicizing the current moment in relation to broader historical developments, like, for example, the history of neoliberalism. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Alan this evening for a talk which will last probably for about half of the time that we've got here, and then in the other half we'll get to have a conversation, and that conversation will involve you guys as well. The title of the talk then is A Hero's Journey, Ideological Entrepreneurs and Reactionary Digital Politics, and I give the floor to you, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you for inviting me to come along and drag people out of the delightful weather in such a beautiful city in the middle of June. So thank you for responding to that invitation. It is lovely out there and I'm very delighted to be here. As Mark has said, the general context and background for the series is this interest in digital media. And I'm very much interested in digital media. But I feel I should clarify that I come at that from not the side of media studies, but from the side of politics, specifically as a political theorist, as someone who is interested in political ideas of all kinds, really, in the big grand books of political philosophy and in the everyday vernacular occasions where we exchange and argue about what we think we should do in politics. So I'm interested in how political ideas are formed, where they come from, how they circulate, how and why in certain moments people get gripped by them and want to act on them and want to change or remake the world on the basis of them. And in that context, then, I'm interested in words, in language. That's how I find out about what political ideas are, in discourse, and particularly, as Mark mentioned, in rhetoric, in the ways in which people use speech actions to try and explain themselves, persuade others, perform their arguments, and try and bring people over to their side. So it was with that sort of background, that general interest, that I'd done that thinking about parliaments and oratory and political texts of all different kinds, that I started looking at online forms of expression around sort of 2015-16. That's an important date because that means I was slightly ahead of the curve, because it was before everything completely took off around the Trump campaign. And I was lucky enough to get funding for a project with this grand title, Political Ideology, Rhetoric and Aesthetics in the Digital Age. So that was a project that was looking at that time specifically at what was called the alt-right. And we did look at the alt-right, although the focus came to be much, much broader. But the core sort of question of that project was to try and think about how ideologies and political arguments and expressions of them and the styles that people used to express and explain and justify their politics and to win people over, to think about how those were being changed by the internet or by what we ended up calling shareable participatory digital media, because these are the key features of it. How was that, and how were specific platforms creating new kinds of audio, visual, rhetorical, discursive styles that were maybe different on Twitter as on YouTube or Rumble or TikTok as we now think about it. So I'm going to start by setting my talk up by summarising the sort of general findings of that project. So the first of those, it's 6 years of work here that I'm going to summarise for you in about 5 minutes. It's worth it. So firstly, that the affordances, the ways in which platforms work, what they enable us to do, how they guide and direct what it is that we do with them, and how they incentivise certain kinds of actions, how those platforms then create very different and distinct sorts of what we call rhetorical situations, occasions for political dispute and exchange, and also give rise to what we call new genres of political expression. We're familiar with maybe the socialist rant, the conservative jeremiad. But what are the genres and forms and styles that emerge from and are quite distinct from emerging from online interactions and from online platforms? And what is happening when politics becomes something that you do, not by going to a meeting or even necessarily a ballot box, but something that you do through a web interface of some kind, with a keyboard, with headphones on? How is that changing what politics is and what it feels like, as well as what it looks like? And what happens when that sort of activity begins to blur with other kinds of online activities, when we're online with our YouTube video and our email and our Word file and the weather report and the news, arguing with someone about trans rights over here while also watching a TV show, watching the sport, or we're scrolling through our Twitter feed and we're mingling reports of horrors and war with the latest fashion trends, with adverts and so forth. How is that changing the way in which we experience and understand what politics is? And part of what we argue, for example, in a most recent paper we published, is about how people on Reddit in a particular Trump-supporting forum came to kind of behave as if politics was like a game, where they would talk about the bad things that other people online were doing and how they would stage raids and go and attack them and undermine their narrative of whatever was going on. So that's the first thing, and the ways in which the platforms of digital media orient us to communication and to information change, create new kinds of situations in which politics takes place and new orientations to it. Secondly, and very importantly, it changes who can be involved in creating and circulating and sharing political ideas. It creates very literally, a new marketplace of ideas. It's not expensive or difficult to set yourself up online and try your luck on Twitter or TikTok or on YouTube or wherever it might be. You can potentially become someone who can be a creator or be a creator of political ideas. Of course, we all know that that's the key feature of digital production. And that's important in the context of politics because it means that you get the rise of what we call ideological entrepreneurs, individuals who can survive, thrive, make a living from the production and circulation of political ideas. They can make political content, and crucially they can do so without needing to be attached to one of the previously traditional institutions that organised intellectuals, ideological entrepreneurs, newspapers, universities and political parties. Through the internet, you can set yourself up relatively untethered from those, not constrained by those, as someone who produces political ideas, and you can make a living off them from advertising on your YouTube channel, from selling merchandise, from setting up a Patreon platform and getting people to donate and give you money. And some people make large amounts of money from that. For a while, it's never quite clear how much people are making, but for a while it seemed there were credible claims that someone like Jordan Peterson, for example, was making at least $100,000 a month. Most people are not making anything near that. But actually, if you think about it, if you can get 1,000 people to give you $5 a month, that's about the average wage in America. So this is a very different way in which we organise and enable the production, creation and circulation of political ideas with these people untethered from parties, journalistic enterprises and universities. But that doesn't mean they're ungoverned. Instead, they are, as it were, governed and organised by the structures and incentives of the platform, by their need to continue to attract attention and hold audiences. So that's one of the forces that begins to give rise to new and different kinds of political communication that are reliant on holding an audience, having it come back, having it feel committed to subscribe, to like and participate in that channel, in that forum. And today I would argue sites like YouTube or TikTok are the main locations of ideological dispute and recruitment in politics in a country like mine, and I would imagine also in the Netherlands. Thirdly, then, one effect of all of that is the recomposition of ideologies. So this is where I want to speak to this phenomenon of diagonalism that informs this series that Mark and Gavin have arranged. This idea that we're seeing increasingly sort of out-of-the-box combinations of political ideas, people combining across left and right, or meeting in the middle, or moving around in different kinds of ways. We've got well-being advocates aligning with the far right around COVID and all these different kinds of things. So I understand that a little bit differently. I think of ideologies, conservatism, socialism, liberalism, these kinds of things. We can think of those as being arrangements of concepts. We have all these complicated, difficult, disputed concepts in politics. Freedom, equality and liberty. People argue about them. What ideologies do is put them into an arrangement and try and, for a little bit, fix the kind of meaning of them so people can agree and organise around them. They can say equality is the most important concept, for instance. That shapes how we think about liberty. That shapes how we think about the state. It shapes how we think about economic activity. But we can kind of agree roughly on how these concepts relate so we can form a socialist movement, say, around them and begin to act politically. So ideologies in that sense are a way of making political ideas partly intelligible, of arranging our understanding of politics, perhaps along that two-dimensional left-right spectrum, so we can apprehend what is really very fluid, mobile and very complex. But also along with institutions like political parties, trade unions, business associations, ideologies are part of the process of organising mass opinion, directing it, perhaps containing it, trying to convert it into arguments, propositions and demands that can potentially be processed by some kind of state political system, forced into a question, say, that can be put to a referendum, or into a proposition in the parliament that can be passed or defeated to take some action to address some grievance, whatever it might be. Now that system, that arrangement of ideologies linked to parties or business associations along that left-right spectrum, you don't need me to tell you, it won't be a shock if I tell you that that no longer works. That's been breaking down for quite some time. The social class groups around which it was built don't really exist in the same way. From the 80s, well, really earlier, but particularly in my country, the 80s, mass media and marketing became such central concerns of political parties, using opinion polling and professional advertising to develop and send your messages out. You didn't need an active membership organised around ideologies like socialism and conservatism or whatever it might be. So that system was already disaggregating and falling apart. But one of the forces that further disaggregates it in the present day is the ideological entrepreneurs and the affordances of the digital platforms that they are on. Online, ideas and arguments can flow very, very easily and very, very quickly between different factions. If you're on the moderate conservative side, you can find out what the further right is saying very easily. You haven't got to go to a different, strange part of town. You haven't got to find a publisher or bookshop that sells their material. You can simply look it up online. And there are incentives for political content creators on a platform like YouTube to share audiences with each other, for people on the moderate right to go on to the channels of those who are further right or further right still, and you get this increasing connection, what a scholar called Becca Lewis calls the alternative influence network, of people more and more connected on a much broader spectrum than was normal, say 20 or 30 years ago. You get a much more of a flow then of ideas between these different groups for kind of economic reasons, because they want to share audiences, and for the technological reasons of how easy it is to share content, and partly because you need to be able to produce content that isn't very expensive, so commenting and responding to the arguments and ideas of others somewhere in your broader faction becomes a very sensible thing to do. So just to give one example, the concept of cultural Marxism, now called woke, which has a long history as a way of kind of talking about the conspiracy of the Marxist and the liberal left to take over the institutions and the media. That has a history that goes before the internet, particularly in the States, where politicians like Pat Buchanan are promoting it. But that concept was very active, very dominant at the start of my research in what Mark has called the bottom of the internet, in the kind of forums like 4chan and posting boards where people were using these kind of terms. And over the last 5-6 years, I've watched those terms, as I'm sure you have, move up from the forum to more mainstream forums, to appear in below-the-line comments in newspapers, to appearing in the articles in the newspapers, until, in my country, cultural Marxism is a phrase used by members of the government. Suella Braverman, who was our Home Office Interior Minister, she's used that phrase, for example, as did Liz Truss, who was briefly our Prime Minister. An example of a different nature in the current election campaign is members of the Conservative Party in Britain worrying that if Labour wins too successfully, it will have a supermajority and its power will be untrammelled and unstoppable. The term supermajority makes no sense whatsoever in the British Constitution. It's nonsense. It's an American term. And it's absolutely something that they talk about in American forums, about the untrammeled power of Joe Biden if he gets a supermajority and the terrible things he do to us. And I can't prove it, but I'm sure that term has entered into the election debate in the UK through various circuits of social media. In fact, I think, as an aside, social media has significantly disorganised the British Conservative Party to the point that it's going to affect its election prospects very greatly next week. But the point is that ideological entrepreneurs, in combination with the incentive structures and affordances of digital platforms, are producing a strange sort of dynamic of both a proliferation and complexity of political ideas, but also a greater simplification as ideas move across broad spectrums on right and left in these larger, looser kind of groupings. And also, we begin to see concepts that hadn't been particularly prominent in political ideologies begin to become, of the 20th century, say, begin to become more dominant, like the body and concerns about health and well-being, concerns about child trafficking becoming very central to the organisation of certain forms of right-wing thought. So the fourth point then is that in this context, I would argue, forms of reactionary digital politics flourish particularly well. These are forms of politics that, as reactionary ideologies do, organise themselves not around positive propositions about what we should be doing, but around critiques of what is going on and how everything has gone too far and we need to stop it and go back to some way in which things were before. And what we're seeing is the organisation of political thinking, I would argue, around this kind of general idea that everything has gone wrong because liberalism and the liberal state have gone too far, trying to impose equality. And because they're imposing an equality that is impossible from the point of view of reactionary politics, it becomes ever more overreaching, intrudes into personal life, manages and monitors and restricts your speech, is causing crises and decadence and so forth. And so there must be a much broader movement united around resisting the excesses of liberalism, a reactionary movement, which, and I'm going to talk about this in more detail in a moment, tends to construe politics in a paradoxically anti-political way, construes politics as really being about a kind of heroic resistance to this pervasive, ever-coming liberalism that must be stopped and resisted at all points. And to be political is to come to understand the falsehoods of liberalism and its claims to equality, and to actively seek to expose the falsehood to others and to bring it down. So as probably many of you know, a key metaphor for the online right is that of the red pill, taken from the Matrix movies, in which the hero takes a red pill and realises that he's been living in a computer simulation. So they will talk about taking a red pill and realising that the claims about men and women being equal or all countries being equal are all part of a lie that you're fed by the schools and the media. And once you've seen the truth, you can't go back, but you need to go and save the others. So that is a very, very short and condensed summary of, as I say, 6, 7, 8 years, hard labour, toiling in the bottom of the internet that I bring up to show you what's going on. But I do that really just to set all that up something else. I want to talk about just one singular element of all of that. I want to think about how some people, some ideological entrepreneurs and some others, how they think about movies. So, because I've been studying reactionary digital politics for years, my YouTube algorithm is a mess. Okay, I don't know what it thinks of me, but it's serving me up with reactionary content of all kinds. And then confused why I occasionally look up universities. But I also quite like film, and science fiction film quite a bit as well. So it was inevitable that at some point the YouTube algorithm would put all these things together and would introduce me to this guy. So this guy, whose YouTube channel is called Nerdrotic. His real name is Gary Buechler. He's a comic book store owner in California, or was in California. Part of the drama of his YouTube channel was him going through Cal-X, abandoning California because it's too liberal and moving to Texas. He's not the hugest person online, has 188,000 followers on Twitter, which is not huge, although it's about 40 times more than I would have. He's got just over 1 million subscribers on YouTube. His most popular video has 5.8 million views. It's called, and I'm going to shout because they're in all caps, Woke Hollywood is Failing, and that's a good thing. Now, this guy was interesting to me because he struck me as a different sort of ideological entrepreneur to those that I was mostly looking at, in a particular and distinct subculture of the internet. Because disputes over popular culture are, of course, clearly important parts of the broader culture war that is going on in Europe and America at the moment. And they have in the past been very significant parts of reactionary digital politics. As many of you will know, maybe all of you know, one of the spurs to the growth of the alt-right in 2014 was the breakout of an online controversy around the role of women in the gaming industry and games reviews and games journalism and so forth, that spiralled kind of bewilderingly to someone like me who doesn't really know about games, spiralled into a massive internet conflict and became known as Gamergate. It's really a quite intense at times, very misogynistic harassment campaign. And it might seem strange to say that this was an important political phenomenon, but it was. It drew quite a lot of people into the orbit of reactionary digital politics. It fired up the alt-right, but it was also a major manifestation of what the American media scholar Adrienne Masnari calls geek masculinity, toxic techno-culture. Now, I don't think Nerdrotic is that guy exactly. I have no reason to think that. He's not quite part of that Gamergate moment, but is part of a wider online subculture and part of a community of online content creators who criticised primarily science fiction and fantasy film and television to quite large audiences, and primarily criticise it partly for being not very good, which I think is often correct, but for it being not very good because it's woke, because it's been undermined and shaped by the woke agenda. And they often express that critique of Hollywood and film and television in classically populist terms. There is an elite in Hollywood that hates you, the fans. And they're imposing their politics on you. And they are bringing about decadence. They're ruining great traditional art and literature, by which they mean Marvel and Tolkien. And they are supported in this endeavour by a corrupt media system, the shills in the mainstream access media, who won't criticise it because they want to get interviews with the stars. Only these guys, these as I would call them, ideological entrepreneurs online, are the ones who will expose what's really going on. So to me, this is an unusual, kind of interesting sort of politicisation, and I thought maybe if I get into this a bit more, it would be a different way of thinking about and understanding these phenomena of reactionary digital politics that I've been talking to you about. Here's another example. This is a guy who goes by the name online, Critical Drinker. As you can see there, just over 2 million subscribers on YouTube, which is very good going, and he has a subsidiary channel for live talks, which has 500,000 subscribers. So he's pretty successful. And he produces, as everybody must, his own merchandise, fridge magnets, stickers and T-shirts that you can adorn your house or yourself with. And just to prove that they're not that minor, here they are from 2 weeks ago, appearing together on the Piers Morgan television show. I won't go into it, but there's been some kind of, just this month, lots of excitement in this corner of the internet. There's a new Star Wars program out. I haven't actually seen it. Lots of people don't like it. These guys have been criticising it online. Disney's kind of criticised back, and it's become the kind of drama off which certain parts of the internet feeds. They got on the Piers Morgan show, and they got to produce lots of videos, and supporters produced videos, and this is a classic kind of phenomenon. Others come in and make their own content off the back of it, that Disney is trying to cancel these guys, blasting them. It's embarrassing, but they can't be cancelled. You can see how it even kind of imitates some of the movie kind of imagery. They hate him, but he's not going to give in. So, as I say, this seems to me a way maybe of getting in elements and parts of the imaginary that underline some of the things that are going on in politics online and in politics in general. So let's look a little bit more deeply then at this guy, Critical Drinker. One of the things he produced was a kind of a series online called Why Modern Movies Suck, where modern movies means mainstream Hollywood, right? Blockbuster films. They're not interested in sort of indie films or non-American cinema. These videos have about 2-3 million views each, right? And in part, they're pitched as kind of telling you how stories should be written and should be told. So advice for budding writers, yeah? Essentially, modern movies suck because they teach the wrong moral lessons, because they hate their audiences, and in particular, they hate men. So this is Critical Drinker, Will Jordan, author of the Ryan Drake series of adventure books about a British Army Special Forces and CIA officer. He's in both at the same time. According to his agent, in this image here, Will's interests include, quote, "You'll be surprised. No, you won't. Military history, mountain climbing, fitness training, boxing, and reading." And as part of his research, it says, Will has been lucky enough to have the opportunity to handle and test fire many of the weapons mentioned in the books. So what's this guy's film theory? So the essence of his critique of film is contained in this quotation, or these quotations. Movies, he says, can teach us important lessons about how to live. It's very simple. They can teach us about friendship and camaraderie, determination and resilience. And those lessons can influence generations of people. to do more than they ever thought possible, to reach higher, strive further, work harder, to be more than they are. Movies are like a set of moral scales that keep us balanced and level, he says, but the scales are tipping in the wrong direction. The movies now are framing negative actions in positive light. They're teaching people shit lessons, and that means they're going to produce a generation of shitty people. So, this is at one level perfectly familiar kind of critique of literature or art or popular culture of any kind, that it's inducing decadence because it's moving away from the traditional high values that it should be embodying. There is a natural, self-evident moral order. People find it hard to live by that moral order, so they need exemplars, stories, legends, and myths that can instruct them so that they can understand that role. So it's a moral criticism as well as an aesthetic criticism. It's a moral criticism in which the moral and the aesthetic are combined in some way. People should work hard and better themselves, but the movies are teaching us to be entitled and arrogant. His key examples in his series on why modern movies suck are Mulan in Disney's live version of that film, the character Rey in Star Wars, and the new Wonder Woman, all of whom are female characters. And that's not a coincidence, because he has a lot to say about strong female characters in these movies. One of the core elements of any character arc, he says, stories must have a proper character arc and development where they demonstrate their learning of these moral lessons, the key element of which is that they face a challenge, they work hard and overcome it. This is, he says, basic human nature. Storytellers have known this for thousands of years, which is why most stories tend to follow the same basic structure. So the idea is that this moral code and inspiration it gives is actually kind of timeless. It's always been there. We know it. It's natural. But with the contemporary strong female characters in Hollywood, that's being wiped away. Self-actualization, the idea she already has everything she needs to succeed, has come to the fore. The message to the audience is simple: you're perfect the way you are. It's the rest of the world that has to change. So there's an ideal form of story then, which embodies the moral theory, but we've departed from it in part by feminising it, or that's a symptom of it as well. And we've created these unrealistic, misleading fictions, and this is displayed particularly clearly in physical capacity. So in one of his videos in this series, he talks about the movie, this is The Woman King, starring Viola Davis. Here he complains, one of the most tedious and embarrassing aspects of modern movies is watching a £100 actress ploughing through a series of extremely accommodating stuntmen twice her size. Then he explains to us, men are generally bigger and stronger and more robust. But this reality doesn't gel with the modern Hollywood ideology that men and women aren't the same at everything. And then he dwells for some time on Viola Davis taking on these young 6-foot-tall men. He's literally half her age and twice her size. A single one of these haymaker punches would probably shatter most of the bones in her face, fracture her skull and cause severe brain injuries, he says. Nobody's buying this because they know an actual fight like this would be over in about 4 seconds. Now, we could dwell on this. We could think about, does he dwell on the violence and the thought of harm? Is that necessary to the criticism? Why is he dwelling on that for such a long time? But equally, we might dwell on the charge that these fight scenes are ludicrous, as opposed to which fight scenes, in which movies. They're all unrealistic, right? Actual fights, if you're unfortunate enough to have been in one or seen one, are either over in seconds or are very boring as two men grunt and squeeze each other for a very long time and nothing much happens. It's not very cinematic. So it seems to me a peculiar form of criticism, but perhaps symptomatic, therefore, of the fact that what's really going on here is more than a kind of criticism of the movies as not representing real life. The movie is not representing a kind of metaphysical real life, some larger ideological conception of how stories should work and what roles people should have in them. And that underlying metaphysical proposition is the hero's journey. For Drinker and for others in this kind of online subculture, all stories should follow the structure of the hero's journey as discovered or invented by Joseph Campbell in his popular 1950 studies of mythology, made famous in part, and not coincidentally, by being used as the template for the structure of the story of the original Star Wars movie by George Lucas. But it seems to me that here, the story, and in Campbell for sure, the hero's journey is more than just a structure for stories, for novels and movies. It's really a truth about the nature of existence, as well as a truth about the place of fiction within that existence. It's a truth about the struggle of life and about the place of men and women within it, according to which the natural and self-evident order is precisely that struggle to define oneself, which you must do through adventure. You must be inspired in your life, therefore, by stories, by other heroes, by myths. And the hero's journey, then, is a kind of non-political, natural form of storytelling. It's traditional. It's the departures from it that are the unnatural phenomenon. Viola Davis starring in The Woman King. These are the impositions, these are the corruptions. The hero's journey stories, like the original Star Wars, are not political. They're just natural manifestations of a timeless truth. Any tinkering with that is an intrusion, is political, is a bad story, and is bad morality. So for me, this then is an example of a kind of wider and deeper way of thinking about movies, about stories, but also about society, history, people, their place within it, and therefore politics. It's even part, I would go so far to say, of a reactionary digital, what we call a meta-politics, meaning a kind of conception. Meta-politics would be the politics of politics, a conception of what politics should be like before we talk about any particular politics, but also of a kind of cultural level of contestation over what is right and what is good that feeds into and is logically as well as historically prior to politics. And that hero's journey and versions of it and that meta-politics are found in many places online and many places in reactionary digital politics beyond those who are talking about popular movies. So let's look at one example of that. So Jordan Peterson, again, I'm assuming many of you will know, but I'll fill it in anyway, a Canadian psychology professor with an academic publication profile mostly about kind of personality and personality traits and how they inform things like including political thinking and other aspects of life, and also a Jungian, so committed to certain ideas about the personality as shaped through certain kinds of archetypes, identifications with archetypes. And Peterson is also an excellent example of an ideological entrepreneur, although at one point he was part of an official institution of intellectual production, University of Toronto. He early on was posting his lectures to YouTube, his long lecture series on a long series of lectures on the Bible that have had many millions of views over the years. But he really hit the big time on YouTube when he took against Canadian government policy on gender identification. That sparked an interest, and he built on that to pivot it a bit to that kind of topic, developed his much broader platform, self-help books and lecture tours and so forth, became kind of a cult figure. He's currently on what is called his Wrestling with God tour. If you want to buy tickets for that, I'm sure he's coming to the Netherlands. His broader kind of philosophy is a sort of melange of themes from theology, philosophy and psychology, but at its core are some familiar themes. That the world presents itself to us as painful, frightening and chaotic. It's hard for people to adapt, and there is a risk, therefore, that people will not adapt. They will be resentful. They will become malevolent, maybe even violent, and they will try and force the world to adapt to them. That, thinks Peterson, is what people on the left do. That's the explanation for the Chinese Cultural Revolution or Stalinism. But we can avoid that fate. We can make sure people are properly well adjusted if they are able to access the wisdom that is embedded in culture and tradition. Culture and tradition will provide people with the narratives they need to better understand, to live with and face up to their suffering in life. and to develop psychologically healthy ways of relating to themselves and to the world. Social orders, for Peterson, require a shared belief system which, he says, quote, reduces uncertainty and the chaotic mix of intolerable emotions that uncertainty inevitably produces. So at one level, despite coming from the kind of, or using a discourse of psychology, this is a kind of classic conservatism of a sort. Tradition and culture gives us the ways of orienting ourselves in the world. Don't mess with it, even if it's not entirely rational. Don't change things too quickly, keep people on the straight and narrow. But in Peterson, that requires a kind of metaphysical conception that one wouldn't necessarily find quite the same version of in traditional conservative thinking. Oops. And it's particularly focused on myths and heroic myths and their central role in how we become psychologically well-adjusted. Narratives of the known, says Peterson, patriotic rituals, stories of ancestral heroes, myths and symbols of cultural and racial identity. These are about establishing a clear, bounded, intelligible territory. They weave for us webs of meaning that, when we share with others, eliminates the necessity of dispute. So they make social life possible by settling meaning before we begin to debate and dispute. This makes for peace, stability, and potential prosperity, he says. And central to this is our imitative proclivity, our capacity to imitate and therefore emulate that which we admire and respect. To admire and adopt the characteristics of things that will help us orient ourselves to the world in healthy ways. This capability for all, this desire to copy, serves to impel psychological and cognitive development, he says. The worshipful attitude that small boys adopt towards their heroes constitutes the outward expression of the force that propels them toward embodying or incarnating oft ill-defined heroic qualities themselves. So we must give the boys these stories so they can cultivate these heroic qualities themselves. So there's a kind of rational, utilitarian sort of justification here of mythology. Society and the individual is saved from chaos and destruction if it adheres to the true myth of the hero's journey and enables its boys to identify with and develop their psyche in line with those heroic exemplars. Here he is speaking in an interview. If you study malevolence, you start to understand what the opposite of that is. It's the hero's journey. It's easy to be cynical about that, he says. It's not that easy, because if you're cynical about that, then you undermine your own life, and everyone knows this. This is the other thing that's so interesting. Everyone knows this. You can see in the rhetoric, the proposition that the hero's journey is this necessary phenomenon that we must live in line with this myth to avoid everything going to chaos and destruction, and this is completely natural, and everyone sort of really knows it. So if everyone knows it, who would be opposed to it? Those are the enemies, the people who want to demythologise society, who don't want us to live by the traditional myths, who undermine these stories, the kind of people that Critical Drinker and others criticise, the makers of the movies that depart from the hero's journey. Knowledge of the grammar of mythology, says Peterson, constitutes an antidote to ideological gullibility. So again, you see here that sense that mythology is not political. Ideology is political, it's destructive, it's a false substitute for mythology. Mythology is natural and timeless and has embedded within it these healthier psychological orientations, so we need to live by the myths, not by the ideologies. So there's a kind of, again, anti-political sort of politics is emerging here. And rational societies must hold on to that mythology then. Now, this is a kind of messy, meandering kind of paragraph, but there's a lot of interest going on in here. Linguistically mediated criticism of the predicates of behaviour undermines faith in the validity of historically established hierarchical patterns of adaptation. What that just means is the kind of stuff that academics, probably academics like me, would be thought to do, engaging in forms of written critique of culture, literature, politics, and so forth. This undermines faith in historically established hierarchies, which for Peterson are adaptations to the world, evolutionary in a sense. The final emergent process of the developmental chain of abstraction can be applied to undermine the stability of its foundation. So the intellectual critic, as they develop their abstract criticisms of tradition and myth, are actually undermining their own foundation. They're self-defeating. The modern and verbally sophisticated individual is sawing off the branch on which he or she sits. Civilized Homo sapiens can use words to destroy what words did not create, and that's left us subject to our worst fears. So I think a key phrase in that is linguistically mediated criticism, because you might ask what kind of criticism is not linguistically mediated. I would interpret this as being a nod to the kinds of mythological presuppositions of some of the people that Peterson reads and quotes, that there's a kind of pre-linguistic wisdom that the species had before it became civilized, before it fell into the world of writing and sign making and then philosophers and scientists. There was a kind of instinctive, innate understanding of the world, which is all being undermined and brought down by linguistically mediated criticism, by intellectual academic critics, by verbally sophisticated individuals, by civilized Homo sapiens who are undermining the mythologies that are necessary for society to be stable and to survive. There's a history of people thinking like this. So-called traditionalists, Messier Eliade is one who Peterson quotes quite a lot, who helped inform and found studies of comparative religion, for example. You find it in philosophers, different versions like Schmidt and Voegelin. Anyway, there's a whole other story. But Peterson is essentially popularising a form of reactionary cultural critique, as I would see it, the one which is especially opposed to the teaching of critique in the humanities. And in fact, Peterson has said on more than one occasion that the core of the present-day problems lies in humanities departments, specifically, and I quote, that departments like women's studies have trained between 300,000 and 3 million radical left-wing activists. I'm not sure how he counted. The postmodernist types have infiltrated bureaucratic organisations at the mid to upper level, and that's what they're trained to do by their activist professors in universities. Those are the practitioners of linguistically mediated criticism. Those are the modern and verbally sophisticated individuals who, through women's studies departments and going out in the world, are undermining civilization. And crucially, they've given women the wrong myth to live by, because they've got the strong female character. We should be reenacting the hero's journey in which men confront the dragon and rescue the virgin. Women's myth is Beauty and the Beast. Encountering the monstrous masculine, to tame it and civilizing it, that's part of their journey. That's their heroic journey in the world. Confronting the unknown, just like men do, he says, and garnering wisdom, knowledge, riches as a consequence. But for females, the feminine archetype is at the forefront and the masculine at the background. And so when movies mess around with that, they're messing around with something fundamental, ancient and traditional, that risks civilization as a whole. Think someone like Peterson. So, let me draw my meandering remarks to a kind of a close. Yeah? My proposition is that what I'm laying out to you is what I will call a reactionary metapolitics, a politics of politics, a proposition about what politics can be and shouldn't be, what must limit it, natural mythologies, for example, and therefore what it can and can't be. I'm not suggesting that Critical Drinker and Jordan Peterson are part of the same organised movement or anything like that. I have no reason to think that, and that's not part of my argument. Rather, that there are ideas and forms of ideas that are flowing and moving around and interacting with each other in different ways, maybe with some influence on each other that some remove. But they're really part of a larger process in which culture and politics is understood through the lens of the heroic epic tale of the great individual who strives to see the truth that no one has seen before, to act on it and kill the dragon, whether that dragon is the EU, or feminism, or the deep state, or big pharma, or vaccines, or Hollywood, or whatever other elite that is undermining national tradition and national culture. And so part of political action becomes defending those ancient myths, calling for the remythologisation of society, the stories which resonate without linguistically mediated criticism with our ancient natural intuitive responses to symbol and story. That's popularised by Peterson and popularised through the critiques of movies that we looked at earlier. But importantly, this has an affinity with digital culture more broadly, and with online systems, the affordances of which can make exploring the world and engaging in politics in particular seem like an individual's hero's journey. It resonates with the experience of online role-playing games, which we move through a world that is there for no other purpose than for us to move through it and to test ourselves against it. It resonates with the ways in which Silicon Valley culture represents its heroic entrepreneurs who move fast and break things. It resonates with the public discourse of social media, which certainly in the early days, and still to a degree, I think, represents it as a means for giving voice to the voiceless, those excluded by the mainstream, that connect its use with standing up to the dragons of orthodoxy and mainstream opinion. And it particularly, I think, resonates with the kind of strange experience of anonymity that one can feel at the same time as affirmation when surfing the circuits of the internet, with the affective dynamics that begin to build up when one is at the computer screen and the keyboard able freely to say the unsayable, in which, as the cultural critic Whitney Phillips puts it, the world looks like it exists just for us, in which we engage in argumentative combat, blood sports of debate with others online. And of course, those entrepreneurs online invite you to start your own hero's journey, to follow them, to subscribe, to buy their merchandise, to join their team against the others. So politics then becomes a bit like the hero's journey. The call to adventure is made. Defend your society and your community from the decadence that is all around. Call your supernatural aid, the internet, which circumvents the power of them, through which you can see reality clearly. Encounter the threshold, the moment of decision and change. Take the red pill and see the world differently. Get your wise helper, your guide, your Gandalf, your Obi-Wan, the ideological entrepreneur who is explaining to you the truth about how the world works, what's really going on. Endure the road of trials in the abyss where the cultural Marxists will attack you, try and counsel you, knock you off the road. Reach the final transformation, stand up for the truth against the lies of liberalism around you, and finally, receive atonement and the gift, launch your own channel and become an entrepreneur yourself. Become the hero with the shield, defending everybody, your family, from all the demonic threats that surround you. So, last remark. All I've done, I know, is describe a phenomenon and show how it's intensified by some aspects of the phenomenology of digital, participatory and shareable media. I haven't launched a formal critique of the things I've been presenting to you. I'm just trying to show that how the platforms interacting with wider social and political changes drive a kind of decomposition and recomposition of ideologies, transform not just what kinds of politics people take on, but how they experience the very taking on of a politics in the first place, and relate to politics as such in this paradoxically anti-political way. And how, in these conditions, participating in politics becomes a very distinct sort of drama, one that invites people to take on positions and identities that are at odds with the mainstream traditional political system of voting and parties and legislatures and so forth. And I think that part of what is happening and part of what characterises the present moment is the disjuncture between, on the one hand, a system of communication in ideological dissemination and how we relate to that and experience that, and the rather more boring and prosaic ways in which political systems generally tend to work as they try to manage multifaceted societal problems. And that, I think, is the kind of key issue, as it were, the practical issue confronting our times. With a new system of media and communication, how can it be brought, or how can it and the political system be brought into alignment with each other so that we can formulate political experiences and identities and expressions in ways that might be able to be processed collectively into some form of meaningful action? Because until we do that, the action that we undertake will be the hero's journey online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. There's so much food for thought. We have about a half an hour, and I think that there's probably going to be some questions in the audience. But I would like to sort of start off. There's so many great terms that also came up. The linguistically mediated criticism. That's fantastic. But I thought maybe I would like to bring up because it's a concept in my field, and that's sort of, I guess, an intersection between us. The role of the concept of affordances within your thinking, and in particular, I wanted to ask you about the way that affordances relate to the idea of influence. And I guess the question is, the concept of affordance is an interesting concept in itself, because it's a concept that comes from zoology, actually. It's a concept about the way that kind of different life forms kind of fit into different environments, and different environments kind of fit into different forms of life. So it's a very sort of weird relational concept. It's about kind of trying to think of several things at the same time, basically, I think, as I understand it. And I'm interested in how we might be able to think about that in terms of these kinds of problems that you're speaking about in relation to the phenomenon of the ideological entrepreneur, what they're up to, and where is the influence coming from, is the question that I would like to ask you. Is the ideological entrepreneur this kind of... Because at the end there, you had the slide of Gandalf as the ideological entrepreneur in the hero's journey. And that seems to place them... I mean, this was also a conceit because of the way that you set up your story, in this position, this kind of pole position. But it seems to me that they're kind of embedded in this system themselves, where they have all kinds of different things coming at them from different directions. Different kinds, and not least of which is their audience as well. So I was wondering if you would care to reflect on the way that you think through this concept of affordances in relation to your theory of reactionary digital politics and the ideological entrepreneur.
So that's a simple question to start with, then, yeah. No, thank you. That's a very thought-provoking question. But stop me if I answer it in too long-winded a way, right? Okay. But you said that the idea of affordances comes from zoologies and how entities exist in their environment. So from my point of view, the animals are ideas, political ideas, right? And of course, there's a common enough way of thinking about political ideas in politics is they're just there. Good ideas, bad ideas, we read them in books, and we agree with them or don't agree with them, but the best ones will survive. They're kind of timeless things in the ether somewhere. So from my point of view, that's not true, right? The ideas are not just things in our heads or in some kind of supernatural realm. They're things that exist in material form, in stone tablets, right, or public arenas where people give speeches, or they exist in books and pamphlets. And the pamphlet's a good place to start, right? The ease of printing a kind of cheap pamphlet in 19th century Amsterdam, fits very nicely with a whole lot of other things in the political world, with parties and working class movements and trade union associations, with a meeting hall and a library, and people can get together and read the pamphlet and have a meeting and discuss it. Yeah? So in that sense, there's a series of affordances there in which the act of sharing the ideas, the dissemination of them, kind of fits very nicely with the proposition the ideas are making, which is that we can all think, we're all equal, we can all be part of a movement together, understanding the world and acting on it to change it. So for me, we can think that partly in terms of affordances, how the paper and the ease of printing it and passing it around and the meetings are the things that give this context in which the ideas are not only read and understood, but there's the form of communication is also part of what carries the political message. You with me?
Yeah. I'm following you.
So now we jump ahead and we're in this radically different context where the ideas are existing on the YouTube channel, say, being articulated by the influencer. So I take it what you're getting at is that we might think of the influencer as sort of being in charge, dripping this stuff into our minds, and then we all fall for it. That's kind of disinfo model. Or often you get the kind of, they're just grifters. They're just making it up and saying whatever is going to get hits, yeah? And what that misses is all the complicated things that are going on, that the person making the YouTube video is getting quite detailed feedback about who watched it, when did they click, when did they stop, when did they go back. They're being encouraged by the platform, by it's Alphabet, isn't it? It's YouTube, so it's Google Alphabet, to kind of improve their technique and get more audiences in and develop it and make it more successful and marketable. So they're shaping it. And then they're behold to the audiences, what the audiences respond to, what they do like and don't like, what gets them going, what piques their interest, and by the algorithm that is recommending things. And so those things, those impersonal forces, drive people towards, well, this is working, and I should say more of that. And I don't think that's necessarily cynical on their part. I think sometimes people are cynical, of course, but that's just learning how to use the medium, how to express and articulate yourself and put across your point. So the ideas begin to get shaped into a particular kind of form that has this kind of, has to meet the certain standards to kind of grab your attention, which we kind of all know from being online. It's the bits that say the truth about, you won't believe what happened when. Watch Jordan Peterson destroy student. Yeah? Instead of flat descriptions, these things that kind of get you going, whether they get you angry or cheering or whatever it might be, that bring you in. And that begins to create this dramatisation of the ideas. Yeah. And then we can add in all the other things that are characteristic of, say, YouTube, the way the lack of money involvement. It's probably going to be partly a talking head, so they're in a personal environment, so performances of authenticity become part of that. Yeah. The fact that it's difficult to create your own original content, but it's quite easy to grab a clip from someone over here or a screenshot of a newspaper. So a lot of YouTube content is kind of parasitic. It's discourse about discourse. It's extracting phrases from here in one context and recontextualising them to fit your own argument. These are created by the facts of the medium, I think, and then feed into and begin to reshape the ways in which people articulate a politics and therefore begin to reshape the politics.
Yeah, I mean, for me, a point of reference there would be in media studies. Also, the Toronto point of reference would be Innes's concept of the biases of different kind of regimes of communication. And he thought that there was a sort of a direct relationship with the dominant mode of communication and the way that society was organized and the kind of power structures that went along with that. But he also had he had this kind of romantic idea that oral communication was sort of which was something in the past was kind of inherently democratic. And as you got away from that to printed communication, you got sort of further from that. And one of the theories from that sort of school of thought, not really him, but people that followed him, was that we're sort of returning to this kind of secondary oral mode of communication. This is what McLuhan and his followers were kind of anticipating the internet to be. And I mean, I don't know if that description fits YouTube so well, but they're doing a lot of talking. But some people have said that might fit some parts of the internet, that this kind of secondary orality which would be characterized by kind of constant repetition as opposed to a sort of a stable base of knowledge. That would be the distinction between the oral and literary modes. but I don't know that idea that he had, that there was a kind of a bias of oral communication towards a democratic mode, fits at all with these kinds of spaces. For example, you could say something like 4chan would be very oral, but it's not democratic at all. So I guess some of those theories are only kind of somewhat helpful to us. But there is maybe something there anyway to that we can kind of hook into with what you were saying in the field of media studies as well. I really like this idea, though, that from your field, which is not really what we would get to do, of putting ideas at the sort of center. And I really like this idea that the bias of communication prefers certain kinds of ideas. But I guess I would maybe then push this a little. What we're seeing here are a kind of influencer, but they're probably a relatively obscure subset in the broader world of YouTube. But are they certainly in terms of the substance of what they're doing on a content level, there's something quite different. But are they that different in terms of somebody who's doing, I don't know, toy unboxing or something like that? There's I guess what I'm asking is how easily can we kind of distinguish the sort of the kind of propagandists of the 21st century from the sort of just general structure of platformized influence? Do these things kind of blend into each other? Certainly from the perspective of the platform, YouTube famously referred to the alt-right as just another vertical, so they don't see the difference. I guess what I would be interested in there is to maybe also reflect on the relationship between these people as intellectuals and the distinction between an intellectual and an influencer.
Okay. You really beat me up here with the tough questions.
I'm gonna let it go to the audience
okay.
After this.
Yes, so I think that. You said a number of things there. I think firstly, yes, part of what does go on is that the kind of, as it were, your example of the unboxing video. Does the unboxing video blur in some way with the political video? And yes, I think it does. In a very general sense, but certainly because there is a kind of genre of YouTube video, or a number of larger genres, I suppose we could say, because, driven by the imperative of the platform to hold your attention and get your attention with something. And so there is a kind of way in which the established genres of politics that we might be familiar with, the political speech, the politician's interview, the demonstration chant, the mass rally, these things that we recognise as being forms of political expression in political situations, begin to dissolve as forms of communication on YouTube begin to flow and move and morph into each other. And we're not quite sure, is this film review is this a political moment, or is this an academic moment? Is this an entertainment moment? What is this about? And that's part of what interested me and started looking at these guys from a kind of different angle, not people explicitly talking about politics, but at some level engaged in some kind of quite literal cultural war, hostile to these forms of entertainment, but presenting themselves in ways that were quite distinct and quite different, and could be compared to, for example, there's lots of other people on YouTube talking about movies, right? There's a whole genre of and there's all these forms, I think, on YouTube that need to be looked at, like the YouTube video essay that seems to emerge and develop as a particular kind of form. And a lot of those video essays are cultural critiques, or they're about film. I think, and not being flippant, but I think a lot of them are PhDs in film who couldn't get jobs and moved into working online. And they can be very long. YouTube videos, as you know, can be 2 hours, 3 hours long, quite complicated, arguments and historicizations.
Rumble ones are 12 hours long.
Yeah. But here's a distinct form of that coming in and fighting some kind of element of a culture war that then doesn't present itself as a political text. I don't think it's kind of covertly a political text either. It's not like people thinking, let's use movies to push our agenda. But inevitably it begins to get caught up both with the imperatives of YouTube communication and then picking up these political and conceptual underpinnings that they may not necessarily have thought about particularly, but then reproduce certain conceptions of, say, the hero's journey and the ways in which we should think about life and experience life and become these broader kind of strange sorts of political texts. I mean, behind that is the extent to which Star Wars does seem to be... I didn't particularly like Star Wars when actually, but Star Wars becomes something people bind their lives around and has some clearly very profound and deep significance for them. Mm-hmm. So there's a confessional element to these things as well. That was a very rambling and non-specific answer, but I'll stop there.
No, that worked for me. I'd like to... It's an intimate audience here this evening. I see some familiar faces. I'd like to give the audience an opportunity to, I think that we have a microphone that we can circulate to the audience here. If there's any questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, we can keep on talking. Do I see any? Yes? Okay. Oh, actually, there's a couple.
Hello, thank you. That was very interesting. I have a question around whether you came across the myth of the hero's journey in a kind of consciousness community online, because my engagement with that idea is rooted in a kind of political philosophy based in concepts of like natural order. And when you mentioned that film critic sort of seeing self-actualization as like the antithesis of the hero's journey, for me that was like, whoa, that consciousness community actually sees those two concepts as the same thing, because the hero's journey is so internalized. And I'd actually never come across that myth as applied in alt-right communities where they're using that story to then, for their own kind of structuralist political agenda. So I was wondering if you could speak to whether you've seen it, the hero's journey, through that kind of political philosophy lens online.
Can you say a bit more about the communities you're thinking of, Jess?
Well, even in just like ecological studies and concepts around like using natural order, for example, if one follows the hero's journey and applies it to their own life, it's really brave to face your fears, and the natural order of the world is rooted in love, and forms of political control are rooted in fear. So the process of self-actualization is facing your fears, and if everyone does that, then the world will be ordered through love, and that in itself is a political philosophy. So that was always my understanding of it, and I was really interested and shocked to see that people like Jordan Peterson kind of half went down that argument and then had like a wildly misogynistic take on it. Like he stopped at the self-actualization bit and then just used it for his own political agenda, acknowledging that in itself is kind of a form of politics as well, but like the kind of perceiving the world as this utopian ecology governed by love. But that's kind of what I meant by it.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. No, it's all over the place. Campbell's formulation of it was incredibly influential in American culture. The book was a bestseller, and it was a TV program, and lots of people were influenced and affected by it in different kinds of ways. And because it kind of draws on elements of kind of Jungian thinking, it also has its kind of presence in psychology, in particular the American versions of Jungian psychology. So it does appear in different forms I'm way beyond my areas of expertise, but it does appear in 70s forms of kind of psychology centered around kind of self-actualization and human potential and so forth. So then it shoots off in different kinds of ways, and sometimes it's used kind of informally as a way to kind of like talk about how you're apprehending your actions and your relationship to the world, and think about them in different ways. Sometimes it appears in a more kind of thought-through philosophical form, and sometimes it appears in this kind of, this is not the only place one would find the kind of reactionary version of it, where it becomes a kind of story about where nature becomes conforming to a fixed divine order, and learning how to kind of adapt and exist in that particular order. So it has all these different kind of valences in different ways. So I don't know specifically those things. I can well imagine different places in which it crops up.
Hi, thanks so much. This was so interesting. I'm curious about two things. First, because it seems a bit that the characters that you spoke about are, in their reactionarism, of course, very prescriptive and moralizing. I'm curious what's your analysis or what you've observed of similar entrepreneurs online and whatnot who, despite behaving in similar ways, perhaps focused on other objects of criticism or not, would actually define themselves as apolitical. So not anti-political, but really, no, at the end of the day, I don't have a political agenda and whatnot. Maybe the reason for my question being that those forms of even a political exercise online seems so even much more dangerous, or anyways, implications being quite intense and different. And my other question is maybe a bit away from reactionarism, but about also what you've observed online on digital entrepreneurs, or maybe I wouldn't call them digital entrepreneurs, but digital whatever actors, influential voices who might fall actually on the left side of the political spectrum. Also the reason for my question being maybe that I'm just quite disenchanted by various digital fora to exercise politics, and sometimes I find a lot, of course my algorithm gives me a lot of lefty stuff, but I find a lot of forms of exercising politics online from leftist channels as almost being as using their channels in as much as a marketplace kind of way as I would see maybe in super neoliberal celebrities online. So perhaps in the way they also commodify their message, if this makes sense. I mean, I don't know, I can think of an example of how your average leftist activist sharing a picture about something arguably very important, at the end of the day also wants a lot of likes and a lot of engagement to raise awareness about that specific topic. So yeah, these two questions. Thanks.
Thank you. So again, there's lots of rich content in there. I'm not entirely sure what you're thinking about in the first part, the apolitical forms of expression. I mean, so I don't know if I can answer that sort of directly, but that's clearly part of a gesture. It's a rhetorical gesture, I would call it. Many people make. I'm not being political, but I think in many cases people don't experience themselves as being political when they're talking about political things online. That's a characteristic of certainly some of the the wider kind of ecology of kind of reactionary politics, particularly the conspiracy side, the QAnon side, is a kind of like, we're not political, we just want to stop this terrible thing happening, which is being done by all the people in the state, the liberals, etc., etc. So they don't think of it as being political. And I think that's quite, to me, that's quite instructive in terms of how people are thinking, because that makes me think, well, what do you think politics is? So you're defining politics in some particular way as this system and this machine. And often it is, as I was kind of alluding in the talk, it's that there's a kind of natural order to things that we should be following. That's the common sense, normal way of doing things. And everyone else is the one being political, and politics is bad because it stops us doing that. So there's not an awareness of the political effort that goes into maintaining and reproducing kind of systems as they are and making them appear natural. In terms of your other question, so that's a superb question, because I tend to kind of talk about the right for lots of reasons, and not the left, and people off, and then the question naturally occurs, were they doing the same thing or were they doing something different? Yeah? And again, I could go on at great length, but on the one hand, I would say, in my experience, in my studies, that the left wing put people on, say, YouTube and Twitter, do work slightly differently, partly because the argumentative structures and the rhetoric are different, because it's not reactionary, which is simply saying this is all bad, stop this, go back. The chains of argument become more complicated, and we need to justify and develop kind of propositions. It's also true that, and it's very clear that the right side of the spectrum online is extremely good at collaborating with each other, promoting each other's channels and spreading each other's messages, and the left liberal side is very good at not doing that and kind of turning on itself and undermining it. And it relates a little bit to what you're saying, I think, a certain presentation of self that is going on, and you call it a commodifying. I think there's two things going on there. One is that, maybe this is a very British perspective, that people on the right are generally not using platforms to get anywhere else. They're YouTubers for a living, or they're whatever they are. They're not trying to get a gig in the national newspaper or get interviewed on the telly, right? Because they hate all of that. They're opposed to it. Sometimes on the left liberal side, people are parlaying it into larger careers. But I also think, because you said a very interesting thing, that people are kind of using it to commodify. And that's where I think it comes back to the kind of things Mark was asking about. Because the moment you do anything on a digital platform, you're always doing more than one thing. You can't help but be also promoting yourself and the platform. The system is designed to push you to that. And all those things, the follow accounts, the likes, etc., you're enmeshed in a series of game-like structures that are over-determining the meanings and forces and effects of your expression, which quickly runs out of your control. With the best will in the world, and most of us don't have the best will in the world, and we get caught up in the, I want more likes, I want more followers, yeah? So I think that's a characteristic of the structuring of the system, and why I think there are limits to the extent to which those platforms can be used to develop forms of political association and political expression that are not defined by those values. Does that help?
We have to make it very brief, but I can pass it to you. Yeah.
One very quick question.
Okay. Yeah. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so.
Thanks for this very lucid talk. Yeah. So I was wondering, you mentioned, right, like that reactionary discourse online tends to kind of interpolate users as heroes, right? Like, and I was wondering if there are any other kind of forms of interpolation that you see within those kind of reactionary milieus, right? Like, I was wondering if there are any other kind of identities that are being offered to embrace, for users to embrace. Yeah. Thanks.
That's a superb question. I wish I had a really full answer to that. But, I mean, I would say I partly got interested in this because this seemed such a dominant version, kind of versions of the hero story, how I came to, perceive what was really going on and fight against it. But within that, then there are different positions for different people, certain kinds of victims, certain kinds of people who experience themselves as marginalised. as parts of kind of not heroic individuals, but of heroic communities, particularly religious communities that are being oppressed, so they can articulate their understanding in terms of slightly different or non-individualized myths of kind of like heroic sects or communities from the American kind of past. You get those kinds of things quite a lot. And it's linked, I think, maybe it's wrong for me to squeeze all of these into hero, but certain conceptions of kind of, free thinker, doing my own research, these kinds of characteristics, which I think can get fit into the narrative of the hero's journey, but might have some kind of independent existence. You definitely see those kinds of things. And particularly particularly religious forms of identification as well. That's a really good question. I'm going to think about more of the different character types. But I think the thing is the reactionary discourse is primarily concerned to name everybody else. It's about assigning other people their roles in the various demonic, literally or figuratively demonic kind of groups that one is opposed to. So the reactionary side is very focused on naming the enemy, and then you recognise yourself as the opponent to that, the hero resisting it. And there's a certain political benefit to eliding some of the differences. That if you want to unite the people who are opposed to, the child traffickers in Hollywood and Washington, and the people who want to stop you driving your car, and the ones who want to stop drilling the oil, and the people who are in favour of immigration, etc. You want all of those to be your baddies. So you want to kind of elide the differences and unite people under one larger mythic signal, and that's the kind of heroic resistance, which takes us back to Star Wars. Because then you imagine yourself as you're the rebel alliance, and they'll often say that, against the empire, which is the liberal state, and you're the ones who kind of have true consciousness and understand what's going on, and everyone else is an NPC, a non-player character, not a fully conscious individual. So it's naming other people in that world, and you emerge as a political subject in the kind of negation.
Okay, we've unfortunately reached the end of the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank you very much for attending. I'd like to thank the audience, and above all, I'd like to thank you, Alan, for an extremely rich and conceptually sophisticated and entertaining, above all, it was very entertaining, lecture, and also a really fantastic way to start off this series. So let's maybe have one more round of applause for Alan. Thank you very much.